You didn't lose them because you weren't enough. You lost them because your love came too close to their fear. One day they're warm, present, almost safe, and the next, they vanish like silence swallowed your name. No explanation, no closure, just distance where intimacy used to breathe. And the worst part, you're left replaying every second, wondering which version of you scared them away, when the truth is far more unsettling. They didn't walk away because you failed. They walked away because you triggered the part of them that runs from real connection. If you loved an avoidant, you know this pain isn't ordinary heartbreak. It's confusion. It's emotional whiplash. It's the sound of someone disappearing mid-sentence, while you're still holding the meaning of their words. And today, we expose the exact moments when avoidant people don't drift. They detach, without warning, without mercy, without looking back, not to shame them, not to villainize them, but to free you from the illusion that this was ever about your worth. There is a moment that looks quiet from the outside, but feels like an earthquake inside their chest. It doesn't happen when things are casual. It doesn't happen when emotions stay shallow and easily reversible. It happens when the connection shifts from this is nice to this is real. And for the avoidant, that shift is not romantic. It is terrifying. You feel at first as warmth, a softness in their voice, a longer pause before they hang up a sentence that almost sounds like honesty. You begin to sense that a door is opening just slightly, enough for light to touch a place they've kept locked for years. You think this is progress. You think this is healing. You think this is the moment where love begins to root itself deeper. But inside them, something ancient stirs. Because emotional intimacy to an avoidant does not feel like safety. It feels like losing control of the one thing they believe keeps them alive: distance, space, autonomy. The illusion that they are untouchable. As your presence becomes emotionally significant, their nervous system interprets closeness as danger, not because you did anything wrong, not because your love is too much, but because intimacy awakens memories they have suppressed since childhood, moments where connection meant pain, dependency meant disappointment, and vulnerability meant abandonment or humiliation. So when your bond reaches a depth they can no longer manage, they don't experience closeness. They experience exposure. Suddenly, they are aware of how much you matter, how deeply your absence would hurt, how much power your presence now holds. And instead of celebrating that bond, they feel cornered by it. Your affection becomes a spotlight shining on parts of them they spend a lifetime hiding. The more you lean in, the more they feel their breath shorten. They begin to overanalyze your tone, your affection, the way you look at them. They start imagining a future that requires emotional presence, consistency, and emotional accountability, concepts that their inner world rejects instinctively, because to them, closeness equals loss of self. And in that moment, when your love becomes undeniable, when the emotional gravity between you grows too strong, for them to pretend it isn't real anymore, their system chooses self-protection instead of surrender. This is when the shift begins. The warmth cools, the affection hesitates, the texts slow, conversations feel distant, not because their feelings disappeared, but because their fear got louder than their desire. They begin to believe that if they allow this connection to continue, they will lose control, lose independence, lose who they think they are. They feel swallowed by expectation, even if you never demanded anything. They feel trapped by intimacy, even when you only offered gentleness. And here's the cruel part. You are still standing in the same emotional place, believing the bond is deepening, while they are already rehearsing their escape in silence. They start pulling back in ways that feel subtle at first, delayed responses, less emotional language, fewer vulnerable moments. You may even feel like you imagine the closeness, like maybe you moved too fast, like maybe you misunderstood the connection, but you didn't. The closeness was real. It just became unbearable for them to stay inside it. The avoidant doesn't walk away because the bond lacked meaning. They walk away precisely because it meant too much, because intimacy forced them to confront what they never healed. The abandoned child inside, the fear of depending on anyone, the shame of needing connection, the terror of being emotionally held. They don't know how to exist inside emotional safety. So instead of learning, they retreat. You see withdrawal, silence, detachment, disappearance. They don't explain. They don't communicate. They vanish emotionally long before they physically leave. And you're left holding memories that still feel alive, while they convince themselves that pulling away was necessary for peace. But peace built on avoidance always carries a shadow, because deep down, long after they've walked away, the intimacy you shared will echo in the quiet rooms of their mind, not as regret, but as a reminder of a connection they were too afraid to stay present for. You may think you scared them by being vulnerable. You may think your emotions overwhelmed them. But the truth is this: you didn't push them away. You revealed a depth they weren't ready to face. And when emotional intimacy demanded courage, they chose escape, not because you were too intense, but because your authenticity crossed the edge of their emotional capacity. This is the first moment an avoidant walks away without warning. The moment love stopped being distant and started becoming real. There is a silent shift that happens when an avoidant realizes they are no longer just part of your life. They are beginning to feel essential to your emotional world. You don't announce it. You don't dramatize it. It simply becomes visible in the way you lean on them for comfort, in the way your voice softens when you're tired, in the way your eyes search for reassurance without needing to beg. And for a healthy heart, this would feel like trust. For an avoidant, it feels like weight, not because you are heavy, but because they were never taught how to carry emotional presence without feeling suffocated. Consistency to you feels like stability. It feels like knowing someone will be there tomorrow. It feels like safe ground. But to an avoidant, consistency triggers a different meaning: permanence, obligation, expectation, a future where their emotional availability is no longer optional. They sense the pattern forming, the rhythm of regular communication, the comfort of predictability, the expectation that they will show up not just when it's convenient, but when it truly matters. And something in them tightens, because to be consistent, they must be emotionally available. And emotional availability feels like exposure. Exposure feels like vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like danger. They've learned, often without realizing, that dependence is risky, that being needed gives someone power, that if you rely on them, they can disappoint you. And that possibility activates shame they don't know how to deal with. It's easier for them to vanish than to risk failing your expectations. So when they feel you beginning to depend on them, even in small ways, their mind rewrites the narrative. What you see as emotional connection, they translate as pressure. What you experience as closeness, they interpret as responsibility they never agreed to carry. The problem isn't that you ask too much. The problem is that they feel too much when asked to remain. They start to worry that they are losing the freedom to drift in and out emotionally. They fear being expected to respond on time, to care consistently, to maintain emotional standards they don't believe they can sustain. And instead of communicating this fear, they internalize it. Their affection begins to feel conditional in their own mind. They tell themselves, if I keep showing up, they will expect more. If I remain present, I will be held accountable. If I stay close, I will have to maintain this forever. So instead of rising to the rhythm of consistency, they opt to break it, not out of cruelty, out of panic. They begin missing calls, responding shorter, creating emotional delays that didn't exist before, not because their feelings vanished, but because their fear of emotional responsibility is trying to reassert control. They begin to associate your presence with obligation rather than comfort, your affection with demand rather than devotion. And slowly, silently, the connection starts shifting from something they enjoy to something they feel trapped inside. Yet, on your side, all you did was trust. You didn't ask them to become your world. You simply allowed them to become part of it. But for an avoidant, that role feels overwhelming. They fear losing individuality. They fear becoming emotionally accountable. They fear being dependent on the way they once depended on someone who failed them. So the moment consistency becomes visible, when your emotional rhythm starts aligning with theirs, they pull away, not because they dislike you, but because they fear the version of themselves that must exist to stay. They do not walk away because the relationship is weak. They walk away because it is becoming structured, because structure requires stability. Stability requires emotional reliability, and emotional reliability demands a presence they were never taught to embody. So they rebel against the rhythm rather than rise to it. They may even start convincing themselves that the connection is too much, when all you did was care in a consistent way. You begin questioning whether you crossed an invisible line when the reality is far more internal and complex. Their nervous system isn't rejecting you. It's rejecting the emotional role they feel forced into. And the cruel part is, The more you naturally lean into dependability, the more they feel cornered by it. Your sincerity triggers their instinct to create escape routes, because the idea of being relied upon doesn't make them feel valued. It makes them feel vulnerable to failure. So they choose distance over devotion, silence over showing up, absence over emotional stability. And when they finally withdraw, it feels sudden to you. But inside them, it was a slow build of invisible tension, a battle between wanting connection and fearing the responsibility that comes with being emotionally significant. They didn't run because you clung. They ran because you trusted. They didn't disappear because you asked too much. They disappeared because consistency made them feel seen in a way they don't know how to sustain. And deep inside, even after they leave, there is often a quiet echo of awareness that someone wanted them in a real way, and they didn't know how to receive it without sabotaging it. This is the second moment an avoidant walks away without warning, not when love feels heavy, but when love begins to feel stable. There is a fragile moment in every connection with an avoidant where silence becomes more than absence. It becomes a language, and that moment usually arrives when you gather the courage to ask for clarity. When you reach for understanding, not to accuse, not to control, but simply to feel safe in something that suddenly feels uncertain. You notice the shift before they admit it. The warmth is inconsistent. The energy feels off. Their presence feels divided. So you do the most human thing possible. You speak. You ask where you stand. You seek reassurance. You try to understand what's happening emotionally. Your voice isn't sharp. It's careful. You're not trying to corner them. You're trying to feel grounded. But in the heart of an avoidant, that moment is not received as a request for safety. It is perceived as a threat to their sense of emotional autonomy. They don't hear your vulnerability, they hear pressure. They don't feel your confusion, they feel accusation. They don't sense your need for connection. They sense an attempt to trap them in emotional responsibility. This is where the sudden retreat often begins, because asking for clarity forces them to confront something they have mastered avoiding. Emotional accountability. It requires them to put language to feelings they don't fully understand. It demands them to slow down and feel, instead of dissociate or escape. And clarity requires presence. Presence demands courage. So instead, they choose the easiest exit, distance. They begin responding vaguely. They deflect. They change the subject. Or worse, they go silent. Because silence allows them to avoid both the discomfort of your question and the vulnerability of their own truth. And from your perspective, everything feels upside down. You didn't demand. You didn't criticize. You didn't beg. You simply asked for emotional ground beneath your feet. But to the avoidant, your need for reassurance feels like a spotlight on their inner chaos. They don't want to admit they're unsure. They don't want to face the depth of what's forming. And they certainly don't want to feel like they owe you emotional security. So something cold begins to replace what once felt warm. Their responses become shorter. Their timing becomes slower. Their energy becomes distant. Not because your question was wrong, but because your question asked them to step into emotional truth they weren't ready to face. They learned long ago that emotions complicate things, that closeness creates vulnerability, that transparency makes them feel exposed. So when you ask, "What are we?" or "Are you okay?" or "I feel like something's changed," it sends their system into subtle panic mode, because now they can no longer hide behind ambiguity. Clarity threatens their emotional escape options. It forces definition. It demands alignment. And alignment means commitment of energy, honesty, or confrontation. Three things avoidants struggle to hold. So rather than explain what they're feeling, they avoid the discomfort altogether. They let space widen. They hope time will dissolve the tension. They disappear instead of engaging. You interpret this as rejection. They interpret it as relief. But relief doesn't come without cost. Because while they may escape the immediate discomfort, they also lose the opportunity to evolve emotionally. And you are left standing in confusion, wondering why your honesty caused distance instead of closeness. The truth is, your request for clarity wasn't too much, it was simply too real. You weren't trying to control them, you were trying to connect with them. But they don't perceive clarity as connection, they perceive it as confrontation. And confrontation feels like danger to someone who has never learned how to sit with emotional intensity without shutting down. So instead of saying, "I'm confused too," or "I'm scared of this depth," or "I don't know what I feel yet," they retreat into emotional silence. a space where they feel in control again, a place where no one can see their inner uncertainty. But here's the painful paradox: the more you seek reassurance, the more they feel entrapped. The more you seek safety, the more they create distance. The more you ask for understanding, the more they disappear. Not because you're hard to love, but because loving you requires a level of emotional communication they never learned. And when they finally pull away without explanation, it doesn't feel like just silence. It feels like emotional abandonment wrapped in confusion. You begin blaming yourself, replaying the conversation, wondering if your words pushed them too far. But your honesty wasn't the problem. Their inability to hold emotional dialogue was. They weren't rejecting your vulnerability. They were rejecting the discomfort your vulnerability forced them to feel inside themselves. Because clarity requires emotional maturity, and emotional maturity requires self-awareness. And self-awareness requires facing wounds they've buried for years. So instead, they vanish. And you are left with the echo of unanswered questions, unaware that your request was not a mistake. It was simply a mirror they didn't want to look into. This is the third moment an avoidant walks away without warning. Not when you demand love, but when you ask to understand it. There's a moment that feels almost intimate in its own quiet way. The moment you begin to truly see them. Not the charming surface, not the carefully curated version they present to the world, but the emotional patterns beneath the armor. You notice the way they deflect when conversations go deep. You recognize the subtle distance when feelings arise. You sense the cracks in the walls they pretend are strength. And without realizing it, you begin to understand them. This is where the danger begins. Because avoidants do not fear being abandoned the way others do. They fear being exposed. They fear the moment someone looks past their independence and notices the child still hiding in silence. At first, your curiosity feels safe. You listen. You observe. You piece together their emotional world with gentleness. You don't judge. You don't interrogate. You simply begin to see the shape of their inner life. And for a brief time, that awareness creates an illusion of closeness. But something inside them becomes restless. They sense that you are no longer guessing. You are understanding. And to them, understanding feels like danger disguised as care. Because when someone sees them clearly, they can no longer hide behind distance. They can no longer perform emotional neutrality. They can no longer pretend that they are unaffected by connection. Your awareness becomes a mirror reflecting truths they have worked hard not to admit to themselves. You start recognizing their patterns before they do. You notice when they withdraw emotionally. You sense when they're overwhelmed even before they speak it. You begin naming dynamics that they have lived in for years without language. And even when you express it gently, even when your tone carries compassion instead of accusation, it lands as exposure. To be seen so clearly feels like standing emotionally naked under bright light. Avoidants are not comfortable with emotional visibility. They learn to survive by becoming unreadable, self-contained, emotionally distant. So when someone begins to read them with clarity, it doesn't feel like love. It feels like loss of control. Your emotional awareness becomes a threat to their illusion of independence. They begin to feel watched, not because you judge them, but because you know them in a way that destabilizes their emotional defense system. And instead of deepening connection, the clarity you bring awakens their instinct to protect their privacy at any cost. So they begin retreating from the emotional space you created, not because you're too perceptive, but because your perception forces them into emotional honesty. And emotional honesty is what they've avoided their entire life. You might say something gentle like, "I notice you pull away when things get close," or "You seem scared of leaning into this," or "I feel like you're protecting yourself." And instead of feeling understood, they feel invaded, even if your intention came from softness, because being seen is not always safe for someone who learned that vulnerability once led to pain. So they harden, they deflect, they close down. Their eyes become less open, their voice less expressive, their touch less certain. Not because your understanding was wrong, but because your understanding revealed a truth they weren't ready to hold. They start to feel like you're getting too close to the core of who they are, and that core holds fears, insecurities, and wounds they never meant to revisit. So instead of letting you see deeper, they withdraw the invitation entirely. In their mind, distance becomes protection. The more emotionally aware you become, the more they feel cornered by it, because awareness challenges their internal narrative that they are unaffected, self-sufficient, emotionally untouchable, and your presence gently dismantles that illusion. So they escape, not because you overstepped, but because you uncovered. You unlocked a layer of emotional reality they didn't yet know how to face. And when faced with the choice to grow or retreat, fear often wins. Avoidants often leave right when the relationship has the potential to deepen into true emotional intimacy. When healing is possible, when honesty becomes available, they leave when someone sees them too clearly to continue pretending, because to be known is to risk rejection. And to them, rejection is worse than loneliness. So instead of allowing you to understand them fully, they remove themselves before you can witness their emotional truth. And you are left wondering how compassion turned into distance, how empathy became the reason they disappeared. But your awareness wasn't the problem. You didn't scare them by seeing them. You scared them by reflecting back the parts of themselves they were still afraid to acknowledge. And in that moment, the moment when you see them for who they truly are, they walk away without warning, not because they don't care, but because care made them visible. There comes a moment in the life of an avoidant relationship where something shifts from surface-level connection to emotional depth. The conversations stop being just about daily events and start touching old memories, unspoken fears, soft truths, and quiet confessions. The space between you begins to hold meaning. Silence becomes charged, presence becomes heavier, and love, no longer playful and distant, starts asking for something real. This is the moment emotional vulnerability steps forward. And for an avoidant, this is where the ground begins to shake. You feel it as intimacy deepening. You sense a softening in their guard. Maybe they share a story they've never told anyone. Maybe their voice trembles when they speak about the past. Maybe they admit loneliness, fear, or emotional uncertainty. You lean closer, not physically but emotionally, believing this is trust forming. You believe the walls are lowering, but inside them, something else is happening. Vulnerability does not feel liberating to someone who built their entire identity on emotional self-reliance. It feels like betrayal of their own armor. It feels like walking into unknown terrain without protection. It feels like surrendering a battle position they've maintained for years. And when love starts requiring emotional presence, the avoidant begins to panic. Because vulnerability means being seen in moments of weakness. It means acknowledging feelings they've trained themselves not to acknowledge. It means accepting emotional dependency as part of human connection. And for them, dependency feels like danger disguised as intimacy. They may not consciously think, I'm scared of vulnerability, but their body knows, their breathing changes, their tone shifts, their energy becomes cautious. They begin minimizing serious conversations or redirecting emotional depth into safer territory. Your desire to connect on a deeper level, to talk about fears, pain, inner world starts to feel overwhelming to them. Where you feel closeness growing, they feel emotional exposure increasing, and exposure to them is unsafe. So instead of leaning into vulnerability, they retreat from it, not dramatically at first. Subtly, carefully, strategically. They change the subject when it gets too real. They joke when things feel heavy. They intellectualize when emotions arise, and slowly, they begin pulling away from the space where emotional depth lives. You feel the shift and instinctively try to pull them closer. You soften your voice. You reassure them. You explain you're safe, that this is okay, that they don't have to be afraid, and your kindness, instead of soothing them, intensifies their fear. Because now, love is asking them to take off their armor, and they don't know who they are without it. So the avoidance becomes stronger. They may start to feel overwhelmed by the closeness. They convince themselves that the relationship is too intense, when what's actually happening is that it's becoming authentic. They mistake depth for danger. They confuse intimacy with entrapment, and instead of expressing those fears, they internalize them until they become the justification for emotional withdrawal. They start creating emotional distance to regain control. Fewer deep conversations, more surface-level interaction, less emotional openness, not because they don't feel anything, but because what they feel scares them. Your openness becomes the mirror of everything they've been suppressing. And rather than face those inner layers, they retreat into the emotional numbness they know so well. This is where the coldness begins to creep in. Where connection once felt warm, there is now hesitation. Where vulnerability once flickered, now there is silence. And you begin to feel it, the sense that something meaningful is slipping through your fingers, but you don't understand why. Because all you did was care. All you did was open your heart. All you did was invite them into emotional safety. Yet that invitation feels like a demand to them, a demand to be emotionally present in ways they never learned to navigate. So instead of rising to meet the moment, they create distance to avoid it. They don't say, I'm scared of this depth. They don't say, I don't know how to be vulnerable. They just disappear emotionally. And in that disappearance, you feel the loss of a connection that was just beginning to grow real roots. The tragedy is this: avoidants often crave the very intimacy they fear. They long for closeness but panic when it arrives. They desire emotional connection yet flee from it when it becomes tangible. So when love begins to demand vulnerability, they walk away without warning, not because you move too fast, not because you love too deeply, but because emotional openness threatened the shield they built to survive a world that once felt unsafe. And instead of letting vulnerability transform them, they chose the familiarity of distance. This is the fifth moment an avoidant walks away without warning. The moment love stops being distant and starts asking for truth. There is a particular kind of tension that settles into a connection when unspoken emotions build pressure. It isn't loud at first. It hums beneath the surface, felt more than heard. A subtle stiffness in their voice, a pause that lingers too long, a sentence that feels unfinished. Conflict, whether acknowledged or not, begins to breathe between you. And for an avoidant, this is where the walls rise highest. Most people see conflict as an opportunity for repair, a doorway to understanding, a moment where honesty can clear the fog. But for someone with avoidant attachment, conflict is not a conversation, it is a battlefield. And they learned long ago that the safest battlefield is the one they never have to stand on. They do not approach emotional tension with curiosity. They approach it with dread. When something feels unresolved, when emotions begin to sharpen, when disappointment, misunderstanding, or hurt enters the space, their nervous system shifts into full defensive mode. They feel cornered even if you speak gently. They feel threatened even if your words carry care. Because conflict requires emotional presence. It demands listening. It demands accountability. It demands staying in discomfort long enough to understand one another. And staying is what avoidants fear most when emotions intensify. You might notice the moment approaching. A disagreement, a pattern that needs discussion, a boundary that must be clarified. You may approach the situation with calm, trying to open dialogue, trying to invite resolution. But the avoidant does not feel invited. They feel trapped. They begin to withdraw into silence. Not silence as reflection, but silence as escape. Their body tightens. Their responses shorten. Their energy becomes defensive or distant. They try to minimize the issue, change the subject, or shut down entirely. Because in their internal world, staying inside emotional tension feels like drowning. You want to solve it. They want it to disappear. So instead of confronting the discomfort, they detach from it. They may avoid calls, delay conversations, disappear for hours or days, not because they don't recognize the issue, but because acknowledging it would require emotional engagement they don't feel equipped to handle. They see conflict as risk. You see it as repair. And this imbalance creates heartbreak, because while you're trying to heal the connection, they are trying to survive the emotional intensity of it. Avoidants often associate emotional confrontation with past experiences where expression led to punishment, rejection, or emotional invalidation. So even healthy conflict feels unsafe to them. They don't know how to stand inside discomfort without shutting down or escaping. So their instinct isn't to work through the issue. It's to leave the space where the issue exists. And this is when the disappearance feels most brutal. You reach out. They pull back. You explain. They retreat. You seek understanding. They create distance. What could have been a moment of growth becomes a silent fracture, not because you handled it wrong, but because they never learned how to face emotional storm without running from it. This is the sixth moment an avoidant walks away without warning, when emotional conflict demands presence, and presence feels like danger. They don't leave because the disagreement is too big. They leave because the emotional exposure inside the disagreement feels unbearable. They detach to regain internal control, even if it costs them the connection entirely. And you are left standing in the silence of unresolved words, wondering how a simple moment of tension turned into distance. But their withdrawal isn't about punishment. It is about protection. A protection rooted in years of emotional survival strategies that never taught them how to stay when things feel hard. So instead of choosing intimacy, they choose escape. Not because the relationship isn't worth saving, but because emotional confrontation feels like emotional collapse. There is a moment that doesn't arrive with drama, raised voices, or emotional chaos. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, but it carries the highest emotional consequence of all. It happens when you begin to change, when you grow, when your awareness sharpens, when your emotional strength no longer bends to maintain their comfort, and the avoidant senses it before you even speak it. This is the moment they realize you are no longer shrinking to keep the relationship alive. You're no longer over-explaining to soften their distance. You're no longer chasing emotional availability. You're no longer walking on eggshells to preserve their sense of safety. You're becoming emotionally awake, and that terrifies them. Because avoidants often feel safest when the emotional power remains unbalanced, when they can control closeness through withdrawal, when they can dictate pace through silence, when they feel needed more than challenged, when your love quietly orbits their emotional limitation. But when you start choosing self-respect over emotional survival, the dynamic changes. You no longer beg for clarity. You no longer overreach for reassurance. You no longer absorb the emotional weight of their avoidance. You start honoring your boundaries. You start trusting your emotional compass. You start recognizing patterns that once felt normal. And something shifts in the air between you. They feel it. They sense that they are losing their emotional influence over you, that their distance no longer destabilizes you the way it used to, that their silence no longer makes you collapse, that their unpredictability no longer keeps you emotionally suspended. And instead of rising to meet your emotional growth, they feel exposed by it, because your clarity highlights their unhealed patterns. Your self-respect reflects their emotional stagnation. Your evolution becomes a mirror they don't want to stand in front of. You begin speaking with strength instead of desperation. You move with intention instead of fear. You stop tolerating what once wounded you. Not loudly, not aggressively, just quietly, firmly, consciously. And for an avoidant, this feels like losing ground, because now the relationship is no longer built around their comfort zone. It is built around truth, and truth destabilizes control. They begin to feel challenged by your emotional maturity, not because you've wronged them, but because your strength disrupts the imbalance they once relied on. And here's the painful part. Instead of adjusting, instead of becoming more present, instead of meeting you in emotional evolution, they detach. They call it wanting space. They call it feeling overwhelmed. They call it losing feelings. But what's really happening is this. They sense they can no longer operate from avoidance without being seen. And rather than stepping into growth, they choose retreat. Because your growth demands their growth. And that is a level of emotional responsibility they're not ready to carry. You begin to notice the emotional shifts within yourself. You feel less anxious, less afraid, less dependent on their validation. You reclaim control of your emotional world. And while that should be celebrated, it also marks the moment an avoidant begins preparing to leave, because your empowerment makes their avoidance visible. When you stop playing the role of the emotionally waiting partner, they lose the comfort of control. When you stop adjusting to their distance, they realize the relationship will no longer revolve around their emotional limits. And that frightens them more than loneliness ever could. You start showing emotional strength, and instead of feeling inspired, they feel threatened. Not by your power, but by the emotional accountability your power requires from them. So they retreat, not because they dislike the new you, but because the new you requires a different version of them. A version they're not prepared to become. They begin to distance themselves emotionally. Conversations become colder, connection weakens. And when they finally walk away, it feels confusing because nothing explosive happened. No argument, no betrayal, no obvious break, just a quiet disappearance that leaves you standing stronger than before, but still carrying the ache of what could have been. And this is the cruel irony. The moment you become the healthiest version of yourself is often the moment an avoidant realizes they no longer belong in your emotional world, not because you outgrew them with arrogance, but because you stopped shrinking to keep them stable. They walk away when you become too clear, too whole, too self-aware to be emotionally controlled, and you may mourn the connection, but you also gain something far more powerful, yourself. This is the seventh moment an avoidant walks away without warning. Not when you break down, but when you finally stand up. You were never abandoned because you lacked love. You were abandoned because you encountered someone who did not know how to receive it without fear. An avoidant does not walk away because your heart was too loud, too emotional, too intense. They walk away because your presence activated parts of them that were never healed. Parts that learn silence instead of safety, distance instead of dialogue, escape instead of emotional courage. And the ache you feel is not a reflection of your value. It is the echo of their unfinished inner war. Loving an avoidant is like offering warmth to someone who learned to survive in the cold. They want it. They crave it. But when the heat begins to reach their skin, they retreat into what feels familiar. You did not fail by loving deeply. You did not lose because you cared honestly. You simply crossed paths with someone who has not yet learned that intimacy is not a threat, but a sanctuary. And here is the truth that must finally set you free. You were not too much. You were not too needy. You were not too emotional. You were brave enough to feel in a world that numbs. You were real enough to stay in a world that runs. You were open enough to offer connection to someone who only knew how to protect distance. And while they walked away, you remained standing, still capable of love, still capable of growth, still capable of healing. The pain you carry now is not weakness. It is evidence that you loved with depth. And that depth, when redirected inward, becomes your greatest power. Because the one who left did not take your worth with them. They only walked away from the version of you they were not emotionally equipped to meet. And as you heal, as you rise, as you reclaim your emotional ground, remember this: you are not hard to love. You are simply aligned with a depth they were too afraid to enter. If this message touched something real inside you, know this: you are not alone in this experience, and you are not broken because you cared. Your emotional awareness is not a flaw. It is your strength. Thank you for trusting this space with your story, your feelings, and your healing journey. May you continue choosing growth over confusion, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over emotional survival. Stay strong, stay soft, stay aware, and remember, the right connection will never make you feel like you have to disappear to be loved. Until next time, take care of your heart. Goodbye, and keep moving forward.